Hello, welcome to Farmgate. I'm ffinlo Costain, the editor of 8.9.com. There is a certain joy in finding writers with whom one broadly agrees, but who are able to articulate their thoughts so much more coherently than one can oneself. Chris Smaje is such a writer, and his new book, Finding Lights in a Dark Age, is the perfect Christmas gift for anyone with a vested interest in the future of humanity. Now is the time, says Chris, for local communities, not multinational corporations or centralised government, to reorganise economy, land, energy and food production so that the light at the end of the tunnel is lit, and when we fall into a global multiverse of crises, we can find our way more easily to a better world. Chris Smaje, writer, thinker and farmer, joins me now. Hello, Chris.
Hi, Finlo. Good to be here again.
Now, Chris, I loved your book and I've only just been able to skim it. I'm looking forward to going through it again in much more depth. But you start by saying that humans today are facing a modern version of Ragnarok. Why Ragnarok? What do you think is the link between 9th and 10th century Viking culture and our own time?
Um, yeah, I mean, I suppose a number of different parallels. I mean, one thing I'm certainly no expert on Norse history and literature, but I think the sort of that there's a complexity of thinking in those legends of Ragnarok, a kind of sense. I think a lot of contemporary culture, we kind of have this sense that there is no alternative, or we've never had it so good, and the kind of openness to really dramatic catastrophic change, and the death of the gods in Ragnarok, that the death of our modern gods was something that I found interesting. But the other two aspects of it were partly uh, the onset of the Viking period, the kind of explosion of the Vikings out of Scandinavia, according to some current historical thinking, was prompted by climate change, essentially by volcanic eruptions that led to volcanic winters. Crops didn't grow for 2 or 3 years, and that prompted all sorts of changes, some of which were already underway. It's never just the environmental cause, it's always more complex. But and that's a clear parallel with modern times, that we are facing climate change and other biophysical challenges that are potentially going to push societies in very different directions. So that was interesting to me. And the third and final aspect was, in some ways, the Vikings pioneered the modern world that we've inherited, sort of trading, raiding, enslaving, and it was in many ways a sort of complex, interactive world of the kind that we celebrate, globalization and all that. But it was undergirded by violence and by, ultimately by predatory military violence, slavery, and so on. And that has very much been the legacy of the modern world. We don't sort of see it quite as explicitly now in terms of, there isn't a kind of global legal slave system, but that was very much undergirded the modern world, and still in many ways the sort of violence against people and against nature. We almost don't see it because it's sort of so in the warp and weft of modern life. So drawing back on that kind of Viking example, I found interesting to say that, we are the inheritors of this, of this legacy. In England, particularly, obviously, the Norman conquest was, from a kind of splinter, a Norse splinter group in Normandy, and that was quite consequential in terms of British history and the sort of later development of the modern world. So, there's all of these sort of interesting parallels that I thought, just to have a brief introduction that kind of connected all that together, with the Norse example.
And you preempted my sort of follow-up question, which was around the Normans and the way in which, they created essentially structures that in many ways are with us today. But of course, the Vikings, when they first arrived, that was the point at which there was lots of violence sort of running over. But once Vikings had arrived, they sort of assimilated, didn't they? And built themselves within a sort of Saxon culture as well, where the Normans kind of just took over. And I just wonder if you could sort of comment on this. You mentioned enslavement and the way that we don't see enslavement in the same way today. But, we have discussed on the podcast in the past the way, for example, that the Gates Foundation is using its power to impose a view of agriculture on parts of Africa, other parts of the world as well, which is very much kind of fertilizer, petrochemical, data based, which in many ways is a sort of modern form of enslavement.
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of ways in which the existing global political economy, there's a lot of bad stuff that happens kind of outside well, even within countries like Britain, all sorts of labor practices and so on, but more so elsewhere in the world, really, we're not so much talking about the sort of mass brutal transportation of people to that kind of old slave plantation model, but there's still
economic enslavement in place almost.
There's still neo-colonial models which and they're often, as they were back in the days of slavery, they're often presented as this very positive, we're sort of bringing civilization and Christianity or whatever, or more benefit to the world. But I guess I am skeptical of that kind of argument, and that's where the bottom up localism kind of argument comes from, really, that ultimately we have all, some of us more beneficially than others, been subjected to this process of sort of global colonialism, and we actually need to regenerate, almost literally from the grassroots locally.
Yeah, let's go back to the Vikings a moment, because I think there's a really powerful section towards the start of the book where you follow an ancient Viking trading route, which of course is going from Norse lands across the top of the world and then down across America. And you paint a picture of a possible future world, sort of taking almost a bird's eye view across that trade route again. Could you just talk to us about, what you see as that future world, and also what forces you perceive as changing the world, and how it will change?
Yeah. Well, it's very, I guess a lot of my writing has been focused on the future, which is always a difficult thing to write about. And I'm almost bound to be wrong in fundamental ways. And yet, partly it's that death of the gods kind of thing. I think we have to be talking about the future because, we are reaching the end of the present road. So yeah, I try and sort of put some color on that in various different parts of the book. I mean, the forces driving it, I think, fundamentally are climate change, and connected to that, energy futures. I guess we can easily get into a whole debate about energy futures, but my view of it is that the world as we know it now is fundamentally dependent on fossil fuels. And, we talk about a transition, but the reality is, we used more fossil fuels last year than ever before. Again, it's almost like this kind of stages thinking where, we talk about, the age of wood, the age of coal, and so on, which I think deludes us. We're using more wood now than ever before, more coal, more of pretty much everything. And that I don't think is sustainable in the long run. So climate and energy futures are really significant. And I think ultimately, in one way or another, we are looking at most people having less energy, less cheap, abundant energy available to serve everyday life. And that the consequences of that are huge. Water is another issue that's, very significant agriculturally and in terms of settlement patterns. Like you say, I do this kind of flight over the United States and also Europe. But yeah, the Western US, water issues are increasingly huge there and are going to change patterns of life. And then finally, what I call political economy, which, I guess is a bit of a sort of jargony mouthful, but we tend to talk about politics and economics as if they're different things. But, historically they have very much been connected, as the Viking sort of history shows. But we are very wedded to this model of constant economic growth. I mean, you see that in the present government, growth, growth, growth. It's kind of the only model we have. But ultimately, it's, again, it's not sustainable. We can't keep growing the economy globally or nationally in the way that we have kind of assumed that we can. We've sort of put our eggs in that basket, and when that hits the wall, yeah, it's hard to predict the fallout. But we're seeing it already in the kind of bizarre nature of contemporary politics, where politics at the center is getting kind of weirder and more theatrical, and then people are having to kind of figure out locally from the ground up, how to, increasingly the kind of services that we have come to expect from the sort of welfare capitalist sort of political centers are becoming more problematic, more threadbare. People are having to innovate, and the sort of political narratives at the center are getting kind of weirder and weirder. So that, I think, even aside from climate and energy and water and all those biophysical things, we are facing the end of a certain type of political economy. So all of those things together, I think, are pushing us into really uncharted territory.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, it's very difficult to kind of predict the future, but I think, gradually converging are a number of different sort of outlines of what the future might look like, which are broadly similar to each other in one way or another. And obviously, people have attempted in the past to describe what the future world will look like. George Orwell's 1984 is a really obvious one. But at the same time, there are elements on there from those books, from those visions of the past that do come true, that do exist. State overreach perhaps is one of those, and particularly if you think of it in relation to Trump's America. And there was something about the sort of the fly past on that Viking route that reminded me a little bit, and don't hate me for saying this, but of Planet of the Apes, of the new Planet of the Apes instead of the
Right.
old one. And the reason was that there was a lot of green amongst the concrete. There was green breaking through the concrete. And when you were talking about big American cities, for example, and the way that they've changed, it was an increase in the amount of green, an increase in the amount of people who were, working as communities, building their community orchards, their community farms, and that sort of thing, as well as this sort of flight that we'll talk about later, sort of flight towards the countryside. But, there were people still within cities reclaiming the land back from the concrete.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, as I think we both agree, who knows what the future will hold. I think it's going to be very varied, and there will be, certainly retrenchment of state power. I think we're going to see more authoritarianism and more, more conflict, more ways of trying to hang on to existing structures and patterns. But I think also we will see state retreat, and which is not entirely a comforting thought, because modern life, we're so dependent on these sort of big structural services sort of emanating from state centers. But nevertheless, I do have some confidence and faith in people's ability to kind of innovate bottom up and generate forms of community, generate forms of well-being. So yeah, I think the sort of patchwork of future cities that I depict in that flyover is partly more green and partly more black. There's going to be sort of burnt out bits and conflict zones for sure, but also people innovating and generating more local livelihood. And I think you alluded to sort of urbanization versus ruralization. I think historically people basically seek out places where they are most likely to find peace and prosperity. And in the last century or two, that has tended to be urban and metropolitan, and I think in the future it will probably be less of that, more rural, and sort of areas that are now relatively depopulated will become more propitious for what I call open country in the book, people looking for good places to live. So yeah, it's going to be a real patchwork. I think all sorts of different things going on in different places, and part of the idea of the book is just I think we're not really thinking about that enough, and just to try and draw attention to these really big changes afoot, and try and sort of guide us towards making them as positive as we can.
Now, Dieter Helm, Professor Sir Dieter Helm, I should say, recently painted his own vision of the future of British farming in a paper, which we discussed on the Wheat from the Chaff podcast, sort of part of the Farmgate channel with Joe Stanley and myself a little while ago. We were quite sceptical of his sort of descriptions of how the farming future should look. And then just recently we had Dieter on the podcast talking to Patrick Holden and sort of talking about Dieter's vision. And Dieter was very quick to say that his vision, he's describing the way it is rather than necessarily the way that it should be. But I think it does come across very often as an excited sort of vision of the future. It's quite high tech. There's lots of AI, data, all this sort of stuff. Is his an alternative vision to your own, or do you think it's just a step down the road, sort of driving us ever more closely towards your own?
Well, I've had a little look at his vision or description. I mean, I guess yeah, it does seem to be the sort of continuation of present trends that I think are not going to be sustainable. I mean, it's a very high energy. Ultimately, there's a huge amount of energy, both fertilizer and traction and transport, but also all the kind of AI and so on, and all of the financialized instruments as well that he talks about, that are all very dependent on stable political power. So I mean, I think that probably what he is describing probably is the way that farming will go in the short term, and I think it will be what governments will, in particularly in rich countries in the global north, will try to hang on to. But I think it will crumble in all sorts of ways, in response to those driving factors that we were talking about a few minutes ago. I don't see it as the way things will go in the long term. I mean, he talks about sort of maths graduates in the farmhouse, and sort of nobody working the land, which, I think we'll see kind of the opposite, really. Will more people working the land, and this is always a tricky thing I have, where I partly I think we don't have a choice about this. My sort of small farm future vision is not necessarily a sort of, it's not a lovely nostalgic vision of how we're all going to be, sort of making our own yogurt or whatever. It's a vision of crisis and collapse. But within that, there are possibilities for people to generate good ways of life and good community. And I don't want to, there is this tendency to be quite scornful in our sort of modern progress obsessed culture, that anything that smacks of the kind of rural and the nostalgic, we sort of distance ourselves from. So I want to speak up for an alternative kind of ruralism that is community rich and labor rich. But ultimately, I think it's going to come out of crisis, and it's going to come out of the collapse of that sort of vision that he has, which is so fossil energy dependent, so central politics and sort of economics as usual dependent. That's not how I see it going long term.
One of the things that Dieter said, quite clearly in the podcast with Patrick Holden, was that, when we were looking at vertical farms, which, clearly a lot of them are struggling economically, even at this stage, because they use, sometimes up to 30 times the amount of energy to produce what they're producing that a land-based system can. But Dieter's view was, well, who cares? So long as it's renewable, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, but I don't think it is renewable. I mean, ultimately it's dependent on very high energy inputs, and it might work. You can grow sort of fancy microgreens or strawberries or whatever to serve, very highly monetized urban markets. And yeah, most societies historically have been energy constrained and have and water constrained and and other sort of biophysical aspects, and have very carefully figured out a kind of local agriculture that's attuned to that. I mean, the sort of urban vertical farm idea, that kind of who cares mentality, I think comes from our present world, where energy we assume is sort of just cheap and abundant and available for anything, and likewise finance, and the two things are very much connected. That's not the world that I see in the future. I mean, I do see a world in the future where cities, small cities and towns, there will be potential for people to produce food locally. I mean, it makes no sense now to sort of have an allotment in a city when you can build a block of flats, just because of the economics of that. But when that changes, there will be the possibility for people to furnish food for themselves locally, potentially using high tech methods, but I think not really high energy methods. I mean, I think last time I was on your podcast, we were talking about the manufactured food idea, and we have all these ways in contemporary thinking to try and get around the fact that ultimately, the cheapest and most carbon friendly source of energy is the sun, but it's diffuse, it's diffuse energy, and we're forever thinking of ways of trying to concentrate it and maintain high degrees of urbanism. But ultimately we're arguing against the physics of the sun, and that I think is problematic.
Yeah, when we're talking about Dieter's vision there, and the way that he sort of, it is a very high-tech future, as as we were talking about, and what you've said there is that you see it as, it's likely in the short term that's, everything suggests that's where we're going. That's what big business, that's what governments are trying to achieve. But at the same time, it's likely to be short term, and who knows how quickly that will dissemble and start to fall apart. And the way that Dieter's described that future, to me, seems very much, it's sort of, it's ever more loading onto a system which is already breaking, within that same system. And so I guess the question around that is, do you think it's possible to escape the future that we fear at this late stage, or is a new dark age really just pretty much inevitable at this stage?
I mean, I'm not really seeing a way of escaping it. And, as we've touched on already, one of the things I do in the book is without trying to evade the huge difficulties and challenges of a future dark age. I make the point that historically dark ages have often been quite good for ordinary people living through them. We very much get this kind of elite perspective of, oh, the sky's falling, the Rome has been sacked, but for ordinary people, often those situations were actually beneficial. When the Romans quit Britain, the archaeological evidence suggests that everybody was, healthier and better off and better fed. I mean, I think it's going to be much more challenging where we're going in the future. But no, I don't really see, it comes back to energy futures, climate futures. I mean, we've got the COP going on at the moment, which, as we've had many before, and they're almost now, it seems to me, that there has been this narrative of, policymakers globally, like, yeah, we've got to tackle climate change. This is, and it's almost like this retreat from, Bill Gates's latest comments, and, this kind of, well, maybe it's not so bad if we break 1.5, or, so, and, we've got no real sort of mass politics and no mass economic alternatives to the sort of growth mania that we've had. So so no, I don't really see that we're on a trajectory to to avoid it. No, which is why I've almost stopped. I've written in the past about, climate change and this and that, and I kind of almost didn't do that in this book. I'm just sort of like,
Take it
this
as
is the
read.
new
Yeah.
reality that we're
Yeah.
facing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um,
And you mentioned the Romans there, and of course, fascinating. There was an archaeology talk that my wife went to recently, and it was about the way in which we've talked about the way in which the Vikings and the Normans to an extent they did assimilate, and that's sort of part of the strength of Britain growing. But the Romans just didn't at all. They came over and very much had their own closed communities, and there just isn't the genetic footprint in Britain that you would expect if there had been any kind of assimilation. And then, of course, they were taking resources from the land. So having gone, it makes sense that people were substantially better off. Now, your book is about light in a dark age, or lights in a dark age. And as you say, you've taken it as read to a large extent that there is going to be, this chaos, this sort of dissemblance that's taking place. But let's think about it positively. And I mentioned before we started recording, my kids, they're 11 and 13. They have, they're going to grow up and need serious therapy. The amount of talk that I'm having, conversations that I'm having with them about the way the world is turning. But I want them to read your book, particularly the end of the book, and we'll come to that later, of course, about those positives for everyday people and the opportunities, the type of lives that people might live. So let's turn to the light. We agree that we're probably coming towards an end, but in mythology, death is rarely literal. The death card in tarot, for example, represents the end of an era, the Grim Reaper in a winter landscape. But as with winter, it's the continuation of a cycle, the birth of something new. And of course, this is what you call finding light, the light in a dark age. Just tell us a bit about that.
yeah, I mean, I think, just to react to your preamble, we get into this very sort of bad dualism of sort of doomism versus optimism, I don't want to be this kind of gnarly old man, we're doomed. But I think we have to sort of come up with a realistic appraisal of where we're at. But then within that, I mean, I call it least worst thinking. Within that, I think the onus is then to sort of to look for the light and look for how we can regenerate congenial forms of society. And interestingly, I mean, I agree with what you said about cycles, that out of death comes rebirth. And likewise the Ragnarok myth talks about after the death of the gods, the birth of eagles sporting for fish, another green earth rising from the sea. So that's what we need to be doing, like looking for another green earth. And I think in it's challenging because we're building from such a low base. We've had so much sort of high energy political centralization sort of take away our ability to generate local forms of society. And I suppose reflecting back on what you were saying about Dieter Helm, I mean, I think the renewal always comes from the margins. I think the center is going to hold strongly to existing models, and we're going to have a lot of high energy, high tech attempts to retain sort of existing populations and patterns around the centres. So that's I talk about that a bit in the book in terms of how London might sort of behave and try and generate food and other welfare for itself. But around the margins, I think there's going to be a lot of people who are by necessity sort of basically dropped in it and forced to innovate their own solutions. And as I was saying earlier, people are pretty good at doing that if left to their own devices. The whole history of farming really is about local adaptation in the context of wider challenges, both ecological and biophysical, but also social and political. So, the light, I think, is in figuring out how we generate food and fiber and other services, the built environment, how we organize property relations, how we how we organize together spiritually, culturally. And, I think there is potential for people, people can do that well. But it is hugely challenging, sort of given the speed, I think, of the the oncoming Ragnarok, and the fact that we're not talking about it, which is why I feel the need to keep talking about it, to keep writing
Mm.
about it. We need to be, the more that we can be thinking through these models and generating bottom up ways of generating the welfare, the food, and the other things that we need locally, the better position we'll be in.
And there are many attractive things in what you write. I have to say, when I'm looking at the society, if I was living in that society now without that transition to get there, there are many positive things. I think, particularly for those of us in the way that you describe it out in the west of the country, it's an attractive enough future. It is the challenge of getting there, and we'll come a bit later, I guess, because I think some people reading what you've written would have political questions themselves around it, whether it's a left-wing vision or a right-wing vision, and you think that's too binary, and we're going to come to that in a moment. But before we do, let's talk about ruralization, because central to your thesis is a flight from the city, not necessarily the whole population, but a significant majority, perhaps. So you're envisaging food insecurity, people leaving urban centres, very often hoping to find land to produce food for themselves, greater security. And if that's the case, how do we avoid civil war between villagers and landowners and those city emigrants?
Mm. I mean, the book, I'm trying to sort of paint a fairly global vision, and it does depend a lot on which part of the world we're talking about. There's already yeah, there's a lot of seasonal labor migration to cities in global south countries, for example, which I think will sort of quite possibly slowly grind to a halt. And people are already quite well connected to a rural base, whereas in a country like Britain, that's not the case. And I don't think we will avoid conflict. I mean, there already is conflict over land in many ways, but it's relatively peaceful, I suppose, in a country like Britain. Well, I think we kind of export a lot of the violence and the conflict to other parts of the world. That's sort of implicit in the way that we manage land and food and so on. But I think the way it will manifest is uh, I mean, I talk quite a bit in the book about land ownership and property, forms of property. I mean, ultimately, that is a social agreement about who has rights of appropriation to which bits of land. So ownership doesn't really mean anything, in situations where all of those social agreements are sort of up for grabs and being renegotiated. So I think there's a spectrum of possibilities. That there is the possibility of landowner power. So essentially a sort of neo-feudal scenario where the landlords, the powerful people, really sort of call the shots about who gets access to land. I mean, I think a lot of people think that that's almost inevitable in the future. I mean, I don't think that, that kind of landed warrior aristocracy model that we've inherited from the past requires a lot of politics to generate it. The fact that we have farmers and rich landowners now who might have a shotgun in the cabinet or whatever, doesn't really cut it in terms of being a kind of neo-feudal aristocracy. The other extreme is land occupation, that we see in countries like Brazil, with landless people essentially taking land from the large landed estates. But I think the thing that sort of particularly interests me is the zone in between that, where I think there's potential for a lot of negotiation and new forms of access to land, new commons emerging. A lot of farmers, if you're a sort of average modern family farmer with a few hundred acres that you're farming with, tractors and other sort of high energy, high tech means, all of a sudden, your inputs and your markets start going haywire, and there's a whole bunch of people, suddenly around saying, hey, I'd like to have some access to land. I think there's a lot of potential there. A lot depends actually on how existing farmers and landowners orient to that. Do they orient to the centre? Do they orient to the status quo, and sort of manage to set themselves up as kind of neo-feudal landowners, or do they ally with incoming people, new forms of local production, and the need to have more people on the land to have lower energy input, more localized markets, and so on. And if they do the latter, I think all sorts of interesting things could happen, and that's kind of what I want to amplify.
There's quite often in the book you talk about innovation and economic opportunity and the way that farmers, traditionally have been very good at spotting economic opportunities in sort of following and innovating within those economic opportunities. And certainly, if I think of some of the farmers within the regenerative movement, obviously again there's a spectrum, but there are farmers who are brilliant at spotting when there is some money to be made that might be in a different way to the way they've done it before. And then of course you've also got those farmers who just want to stick with the status quo. So as you say, there will be a sort of either end of that spectrum that you're talking about. You've got farmers who will desperately try to hang on to their land and will be trying to defend that, but at the same time you'll have others who are perhaps seeing an opportunity for making a bit of money through engaging with the community in sort of letting out smaller half-acre sections of land perhaps to families or sort of smallholders, in order that they're able to maintain some control of what they will still perceive, I guess, as being their land. But at the same time, it's sort of they're taking some of the heat out of the situation by engaging creatively with it. And I'm interested that there are one or two farmers already doing that. And I'm thinking about, the Lees up in Cumbria, at Trepenna Farm, where, they are actively thinking about the future and have set aside, or are thinking about, 10% of their farm specifically being used to produce food for the community. So that, if this sort of thing starts to happen, if we start to see this disassembly, there is already this relationship with the community that can then be built up and built on.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a story that hasn't yet been written, but is sort of starting to get written. And I think a lot of our existing sort of political, mind maps about the way politics work aren't really relevant to it. This is the time when, people can write these stories anew. But I do think. The farm sector, going back to Dieter Helm's vision, I guess, it has got accustomed to a lot of cheap, abundant energy and a lot of money sort of floating around in one way or another. And I think neither of those things are going to be the case in the future. So the real richness is the land itself and its capacity to produce, and people, who are there and able to work to produce things, and that can go in all sorts of ways. And as you say, farmers are beginning to think about that and sort of stacking micro enterprises on bigger farms to serve local markets. So all of that stuff. This is the time to be thinking about it and experimenting. And there is, I mean, we do it a little bit on our holding, in a very small scale way. And it does generate social tensions and questions about, who ultimately calls the shots, what does ownership mean? But, this is what we need to be working on and sort of figuring out how we do this, how we collaborate, how we cooperate with people, how we give people the ability to generate welfare, generate food and services. And, I think what we can learn from past societies is that it's very complicated, that there's all sorts of levels of family, household, sort of community, larger structures, commons, and I think we tend to, sometimes we're a little bit sort of non-musical, sort of a little bit yeah, I'm struggling to think of the word, not very imaginative about how we think about these these relationships, and we can learn a lot from past farm societies that had to generate welfare with little money and little energy, and did it through really thoughtful, complicated social arrangements, and that's what we need to do now.
You mentioned mind maps, and it just put me in mind again of the way in which we can have one strategy after another. There are loads of plans, loads of reports that come into government, come out of government, and nothing seems to change. And I think there's a degree to which within this book, and as I've sort of said to you before we were recording, I've really genuinely enjoyed this book. I thought it was the most engaging. For me, it was the best book that you've written, and it's really accessible. And I think one of the reasons for that is because of the storytelling that you have within it, both at the beginning and the end. This flyover over the Viking trade route that we talked about earlier, but also this description at the end of your new local world. And I think there is something about storytelling and about theatre and the arts that can perhaps create a change or describe a change that people can see themselves in much better than any report or mind map can ever do. And as I say again, I just really encourage people to get hold of the book, because it is a really, really good read. Now, one of the things that I wanted to move on to was talking about governance, which you mentioned there. But governance and law, of course, will still exist in one form or another. But you're imagining a scrappier world of mixed dependencies and enterprise. And I wonder, thinking about stories, if you can tell me the story about the world described by Daniel Defoe in 1724 when he encountered the cheddar cheese industry.
Right. Well, that was, yeah. I mean, I talk about commons in the book, and again, I think the way that we tend to talk about commons now is, it's a bit too coloured by existing political, left-right dualities or whatever. And yeah, so Defoe's tour through the whole island of Great Britain, when he visited Cheddar, just up the road from us here. It's just an interesting example of that kind of subtlety of thinking about how you generate well-being. So basically, families, households would own cows individually and milk them individually. And I mean, I'm possibly extrapolating a bit from Defoe, but I think this is how it works. This is certainly how it works in a lot of sort of pastoral varying economies worldwide, and sort of people at an individual household level figure out supplementary feeding and haymaking and that kind of thing. But then the cows are grazed in common. So, having been milked in the morning, the cow herd takes them off to the common pasture. And so that's, pasturage, that there are these kind of whole landscape things that really lend themselves to commons in low energy, low monetized situations. So grazing is one, irrigation is another, sort of woodland use of woodlands would be another classic one. So yeah, so the cows are off grazed in common, then they come back in the evening to be looked after individually. The milk is made into cheese in a sort of collectively, there's a sort of cheese making facility that's shared in common. And then the cheeses sort of go back to sort of individual households to use or to sell. So there's this kind of complex dance between individual household and more collective commons based arrangements, which one of the problems I think is that whole dynamic gets co-opted by modern political thinking about either the need for us to do everything collectively in common, the kind of left-wing view, versus everything has to be sort of organized through private property rights, sort of more right-wing view. But the reality is farm societies, they figure out the ways that this actually works, sort of ecologically in terms of best use of resources, but also socially in terms of where do we have to come together and collaborate, and where is it best for us to just to get on with it and sort of have our own autonomy to sort of manage our resources. So yeah, that example from Defoe in Cheddar was a good one of the the complexity of that, and the way that people figure out good solutions locally. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I thought it was fascinating. And as you say, that sort of combination of individualism and collective action, within a business setting as well as a common setting, it was a real combination of different elements. But of course, in 1700, or it was 1724, that Defoe was doing his tour, Britain's population was just about 6 million. Today, it's about to tip 70 million. Can that many people in Britain live an agrarian life or live reliant on an agrarian food and fibre economy, do you think?
I mean, it's challenging, and obviously the long term, if we kind of spool it out over long term history, I think there will be less people in Britain than there are now, and probably more people in parts of Eastern Europe, say, which are now, relatively depopulated. But in the short term, I mean, I don't know. I've done some sort of back of the envelope number crunching, and people like Simon Fairley have as well. And of course, there's more mainstream, his name has escaped me now. The
Food
food.
Farming and Countryside Commission.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So I think it's challenging. I mean, but ultimately people can produce an awful lot of food and fiber on small acreages. The key thing there is human labor. So I encounter a lot this sort of notion that small farming can't feed the world. It's not productive enough, and really I think. There are all these sort of quite technical debates. In some contexts, there's evidence that shows that small farming can actually be more productive per acre than large scale farming. Others might dispute that, but my view is sort of generally that it's kind of scale neutral. And part of the problem we have globally is this massive overproduction in farming where, we're sort of cutting down the Amazon rainforest to sort of pointlessly grow soy or whatever. So generally I think the problem is, it's not productivity of small scale farming, and I think we could just about produce enough food for ourselves. There would be less luxury food, there would probably be less meat than people are accustomed to in the existing diet, and we'd have to start thinking of livestock more in the old way as a kind of ecological servants of the farm, where the meat and the milk and other products from animals are a kind of bonus rather than, going to McDonald's every night or whatever we do. But yeah, I think conceivably we could do it. Again, the challenge is even thinking that that's something that we should be doing, within sort of existing politics, and, the speed of transition to it, that, the lack of skills, having to rethink, access to land, all of the politics and all of the sort of, cultural vision around it. We're so not up to speed with that I see as the main challenge, not necessarily, the
The
actual
abundance.
productivity of the land. Although, saying that, I think the density of population in a country like Britain, wouldn't really have arisen, out of a low energy agriculture. So it is challenging, but I think we sometimes mislead ourselves. You get this sort of stuff like 50% of the nitrogen in people's bodies comes from Haber Bosch, and then people say, therefore, if we didn't have synthetic nitrogen, half the world's population would be dead, and that isn't true. I mean,
Yeah. They
we
existed for quite a
we
long time before Haber-Bosch. Yeah.
yeah, and Haber Bosch sort of enables us to sort of buy ourselves out of certain kinds of engagement with the land. But, if we had that engagement, could we sustain the existing world's population? I don't know, arguably, perhaps, yes. But there's a whole bunch of other challenges. I mean, going down the existing, the sort of Dieter Helm route, we are going to still ultimately face the same reckoning, I think. So,
Yeah.
this isn't some kind of ducking of the challenge of feeding the world. It's actually stepping into that challenge rather than assuming that there's a kind of techno fix high energy solution to it.
Yeah, and certainly within the book, and you alluded to it there in your answer, you're talking about, the animals that are there. Land isn't being used to grow feed for those animals. The animals are working within the land or the waste and the scraps, that are produced through other processes. And I was thinking as well, as you were talking about the way in which an allotment or market garden can produce so much food year
Mm,
round when it's well tended, in comparison with half an acre or an acre of a conventional potato field, for example, which is simply growing potatoes, and that's all it does. And so if you're sort of thinking about that smallholder vision, then there is the real potential to grow significantly more. But at the same time, we've talked about 70 million people here. If we're likely to see the kind of ecological crisis and the human responses, the conflicts, the interruption in food systems worldwide that are likely to arise from those ecological crises, we're going to see a mass migration from the global south, and they're not all going to get here, but probably quite a few are going to get here. And I guess it comes back to, how do we sort of furnish that future? How do we feed that future? And again, it comes back to that Dieter Helm perspective, and also the perspective we were discussing in the last podcast that we did together about lab produced food. you know can we produce enough if the population doubles, for example, in Britain? Because that's going to be challenging on whether it's high tech or,
mm.
sort of agrarian.
Yeah, I mean, tricky questions. I think,
Yeah, you didn't come here for an easy life.
well, it's partly, my skills as a crystal ball gazer are, despite the fact I write about the future a lot, I'm just as clueless as everybody else, really. But I mean, I think the migration thing is, uh, it's obviously a huge controversial political topic, and I think in some ways it's overstated. Most global migration is within countries or within regions. I'm not sure that we're going to see sort of mass migration from the global south to countries like Britain. And, it depends obviously on the sort of future scenarios we're talking about. People talk about the AMOC shutdown and the fact that, the temperatures in Britain could suddenly plummet as a result of, these sort of complex dynamics of climate change. And then we will be the ones that will be migrating, kind of white folks in boats heading across the Mediterranean to places like Libya. How do we feel about that? But I think the key is to keep emphasizing sort of local production, meeting needs through the job rich local agricultures. And I mean, for example, my son is currently doing really interesting research in Bangladesh, where the narrative there is, threat of climate change, sea level rises, let's get into shrimp farming, which is a very sort of capital intensive, environmentally destructive type of farming that is kind of seeded by global capital, as compared to people wanting to be rice farmers, and being able to produce a lot of food and a diverse diet, not just rice, but a much more diverse diet of vegetables and other things locally. And so we have this kind of narrative that, climate change means that, we need these sort of high tech solutions as people are going to be on the move. And that, in a way, I think undermines what we need to be doing, which is supporting people in place to avoid that kind of overproduction that you alluded to
Mm.
of shrimp or soy, that's being used as livestock fodder or for biofuels or bio-industrial inputs. We need to, we need to not be doing that, and to be thinking much more locally about land as actually being promoting of people's lives. And, I think we do need to be, that needs to be not in a kind of closed, we're the locals, nobody else, I mean, allowed here. We've sort of touched on that already, but I think that the sort of the idea of sort of huge global population flows. I mean, I think that will happen over the very long term. As I said, people move to where they will find peace and prosperity. ultimately, I think that means life will be less urban, more rural. There'll be more people in Eastern Europe or the northeastern US, say, than in the Western US and Western Europe. So, these patterns will happen, and they can happen in better or worse ways. And, I don't think it really benefits anybody to have these kind of militarized borders and a lot of articulation of sort of, you know, local land for local people kind of mindset.
Yeah.
But I think it's doable. If we focus on producing well-being, not on producing global commodities, using high energy sort of methods and sort of footloose global capital. There will be population movements. There will be places that are increasingly not propitious for life. But I think we need to avoid overly dystopian thinking about, nobody will be able to live in this huge swathe. Everyone will be coming to Britain. So, we need this
Mm.
kind of high energy, high tech solution, that ultimately I think is going to cause, I mean, we've had arguments, obviously, in my previous book, sort of arguing with George
Mm.
Monbiot along this line. I guess, he thinks my vision is going to lead to mass death. I think his vision is going to lead to mass death. I mean, it'd be nice if we could have a more,
Yeah.
yeah, even-tempered discussion about it. But
Yeah.
I don't think it helps to get into these sort of mega dystopian, mega migration scenarios that then prevent us from developing good bottom-up local solutions that can potentially benefit everybody who's in place and, people elsewhere too.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if we're sort of taking things to the nth degree, to the sort of more extreme end, then it helps to sort of uh, identify a potential challenge, but you've got to walk back from that quite quickly, haven't you, in order to sort of find sensible, practicable approaches to it.
Yeah.
And you sort of talked within there about sort of militarized borders and this sort of thing, and the way that nationalism can sort of drive you to hoard your own resources at the same time as defending your borders so other people don't come and use those resources. And we can think of that at farm level or at country level. But one of the things you talk about in your book is the way that you think that people will need to become more indigenous. And I think indigenous is a word that's often misused by nationalists. And so I wonder if you could just talk about what you mean by indigenous, and just very briefly how it will happen, how people will become more indigenous.
Yeah, well, there's a whole little section in the book about becoming more indigenous, and it is a very tricksy word. I mean, in the sort of English speaking world, most countries, if we're talking about Australia or the USA, when we talk about indigenous people, we mean the Aboriginal, the native people who were essentially displaced and subjected to genocide ultimately. And the narrative then, that old progress narrative was that they were kind of yesterday's people who were being swept away. And now we've almost flipped that, and it's like, well, the indigenous people, are the land defenders, the water defenders. They know
Mm.
how to look after the land. And there's a lot of truth in that. I think sometimes yeah, we almost sort of flip the romanticism. It's kind of an argument that we're having with ourselves in the global north, for sort of, the rich Western countries using indigenous people as a sort of, as a kind of counters in that argument. But what it means, I think, which is what it's always meant, which is learning to live locally, learning to be indigenous to place. It's not being an indigenous person. And that's where the nationalism comes in. The way that people talk about indigenous in Britain is, it's a kind of code word for white. It's like, that's where a very problematic nationalism kind of, basically wants to, exclude people from other parts of the world, and it's racially coded. When we you sort of see that in the US with Trump sort of granting asylum to white South Africans. I mean, that there's a kind of real lack of reckoning with the history of racism and the history of colonialism. So indigenous, partly in outside of Britain, in the Anglophone world, it's partly about ways of life, but it's also about politics. It's also about an indigenous nation defining its own borders, all of that complex history of sort of land theft and sort of negotiating, land back and so on. So that is partly in my mind in all this, but it's more about the ecology of the land. Actually learning to live locally on less exotic resource, less water inputs, less energy inputs, that indigenous people have done. And we almost, we have this kind of weird duality where it's almost, if you argue for sort of indigenous self-determination, people are like, yeah, it's great if, indigenous people can live, a sort of traditional local land-based lifestyle. But then if you say, yeah, well, we should be doing that too, we sort of rich white Westerners, and it's like, oh, no, you're being sort of nostalgic. But that is what we have to do. That is the world that we're facing. So being indigenous means taking those steps to, really looking at what local landscapes, waterscapes can, what they can provide, for us for the necessities of everyday life, and not assuming that we can just use abundant, cheap energy, abundant finance, or our political power. It's a huge issue in Britain in terms of, which I suppose relates to your earlier question. We haven't been self-reliant in food historically for many years, not because we can't be necessarily, but because it's easier for us just to sort of use colonial connections or buy in food from other parts of the world. And particularly you mentioned horticulture earlier, buying in labor, which is where we get back to the migration issue. We either because energy is cheap and human labor is dear, we tend to either import cheap labor, or import goods produced through cheap labor elsewhere. We need to take more responsibility for that ourselves, and that ultimately is what being indigenous means. It's not about the particular people or the color of their skin who are doing this locally. It's about learning how to generate welfare and well-being from local resources, and most parts of the world have got very ecologically rich and thoughtful traditions of livelihood production, as we do throughout Britain. And that's what we need to learn. That's what we need to focus on. That's what being indigenous means to me.
Chris, we've been talking for an hour and I've still got two or three questions, but I always enjoy talking to you so much. I hope you don't mind if we carry on,
No, sure.
just a little bit. And while you were talking, it reminded me of a podcast, I think from about 3 years ago, on Farmgate, that I just want to signpost people to. And I think it's called Indigenous with the Earth. So if people search Farmgate podcast, Indigenous with the Earth, it should come up. And that's an interview with Reginaldo Hazlitt Marroquin, who, talks very beautifully and passionately about what being indigenous means. So I just wanted to signpost people in that particular direction. Now, you describe a transition from a world where homogeneity is queen to a future where context is king. And I wonder who will decide that future, within that, what the role of government is, what the role of governance is.
Well, yeah, I mean, I suppose the way I address that in the book, I have these three celestial metaphors. I don't know how well they work, but I was trying to sort of find an engaging way of describing it. So I talk about suns, supernovas, and solar systems. So the sun model is like the existing nation state model, where the laws of the land are sort of set within the political capital and sort of apply everywhere. And I think, we're gonna, as we were talking about earlier, really, I think, government is going to come from the center. We're still going to get that attempt to impose that sort of nation statist model, on which I think, things like Dieter Helm's vision sort of rely on that. but increasingly, as I've been saying, I think that's going to sort of fray around the edges, and there will be a need to create governance bottom up. Here in the People's Republic of Frome, we've got our sort of little independent town council that's done great work on that, but obviously very much within, and I talk a little bit about that in the book, but very much within the limits of the existing system. So, I think we're going to have this tension between the existing model of very centralized government, that sort of fraying and people, having to innovate bottom up. We will get, what I call the supernova model, which is, big explosive superpower politics. Who knows how that's all going to pan out, the US, China, Ukraine, Russia, so there is a chance that this could go very nasty in a very big way. But I also talk about the solar system model, which emerges from a lot of studies of historic peasant societies, where you sort of get this pulse of political power and a sort of complexity to political power that we've kind of forgotten about in modern times. That we just have this very singular model of the government, Westminster or Washington DC or whatever. But the reality for a lot of people's lives historically is that there's some king in a distant capital, and there's probably some local potentates as well, and there's also religious power, and then there's kind of more local forms of power, and it's a much more complex field that can sort of pulse between different centers. So that's what I mean by a kind of solar system model, that there might be, the sun, Westminster is the sun, as it were, but then there's the earth and the moon, and people are sort of placed in sort of complex ways with respect to those different sources of power, and are also sort of creatively navigating those forms of power, trying to keep the king at bay and sort of, tugging the forelock when necessary, but actually getting on and sort of doing their own politics, generating their own life locally. So, I think we need to be aware of those kind of models and not to keep assuming that, we need to write a policy document about the future of farming and sort of get the Keir Starmer's government to sort of take it seriously and sort of generate it all top down. I think this will emerge historically anyway out of the drivers that we talked about earlier, but it's as well to be aware of it culturally and to be a little bit more sort of determinedly local and autonomous in our political thinking, and not to keep orienting to the centre the whole time.
I always think of the, in this conversation, the constitutional peasant sketch in Monty Python and the Holy Grail, where I can't remember, it's Michael Palin, isn't it? I think who's just astonished to discover that they actually have a king because they live in an anarcho syndicalist commune. And you mentioned the supernova as well.
Yeah, so that's basically just, I think we're sort of seeing that now with, the US has been the global superpower, really, and it is beginning to lose that power. And that there's a fear that what will happen is that it will kind of lash out in all sorts of unpredictable ways, which I think we're kind of seeing. And likewise, so China, Russia, sort of regional powers, flashpoints over, Ukraine, and there's endless other iterations of that. So the supernova is when the sun kind of explodes. I mean, I'm not an astronomer. I'm probably getting this all totally wrong, in terms of the physics of it. But the fear is that the supernova is when the state explodes in its attempt to to try and maintain its power. And, there may not be much that, that we sort of here in southwest England can do about, what Trump and Putin and Xi are talking about. But, that's where I think we have to have a certain kind of cultivate a certain kind of autonomy and indifference to that and to sort of try and generate, what we need locally as best we can. And it may all come to nothing and, we might get nuked or whatever. But if, if people are doing that.
Look on the bright side.
Yeah. Yeah, you think my book's looking miserable, you ain't seen nothing. But yeah, I think that's all that people have ever done historically. They have cultivated well-being as best they can locally and tried to develop autonomies. And sometimes it's like, well, actually, I'm going to step into power. And there's sort of a lot of interesting historical debates about this sort of stuff, the
Mm.
extent to which the industrial revolution, for example, was sort of top down or bottom up, but people sometimes you have no choice. Most of us in contemporary society, contemporary Britain, we don't really have much choice. We've all got our sort of national insurance numbers and endless bureaucracy, and have to navigate centralized power. I suppose what I'm arguing is, let's also, I'm not suggesting that we sort of have a revolution and try and sort of knock all that out, or that we, I no longer really have any faith in any politics that sort of says if we get the right people in Westminster, then everything will be fine. I don't think creative politics is going to be coming from political centres in the future, from Westminster or Washington DC. So I think we need to cultivate whatever type of accommodation or indifference to centralized power, and embracing what it can achieve. I'm not saying that all politicians are evil and corrupt and nothing good has ever come, but I think ultimately that is an old and failing model. So what we need to do as best we can is generate new, this solar system model, sort of new well-being locally, because ultimately I don't think, the centralized state is gonna sort of save us. It's too wrapped up in its own battles, and of greater, as in that global power politics, or more local
Yeah.
nature. But it's ultimately, there's sort of interesting writing about this, that ultimately there's almost a deal between the public and the state, that, we will pay our taxes and, follow the laws, and you will provide us with health services and other needed
Mhm.
services. Increasingly, we're getting less and less back from the state,
Yeah.
because of the nature of the growth model, and other aspects of the way that the global political economy works. So there comes a point when it's like, well, why am I actually towing the line with this state power in terms of what it's giving me? And this is where we see historically, the fall of Rome and sort of other such examples, in some ways follows that model. So it's like, yeah, we need to generate this politics bottom up, and that's what I'm trying to amplify in the book.
I'm struck by the way that you describe it in the book. You sort of talk, on your sort of journey towards the end of the book, you talk about the way in which someone's trying to get out of London and they're trying to move to the West. And it's the way in which you have this, still quite powerful centre in
Mm,
London, which still maintains power, I guess, up to sort of around the home counties, but then it starts to disseminate. And I'm sort of thinking really in visual terms of a pond where you've got a perpetual fountain that's still bubbling over at one point in the pond. But actually, there are lots of stones that throw in, and you've got the ripple effect from these sort of slightly larger stones, maybe the governance coming out of Bristol, for example, or
mm.
out of Liverpool. At the same time as you've got this sort of big rippling coming from London, but then smaller stones where you have individual villages or towns, like you say, as you call it, the People's Republic of Frome, that are delivering, within their own context. And in the context of governance, I talked about this question with you before we recorded, and you pushed back and you said, look, I do talk about religion, I do talk about the church, but I think there's a degree to which the church that you're seeing, you're sort of drawing on the past and the way the church has worked in the past to an extent, different kind of schools of religious thought. What I'm more concerned about is the way that the church, when you have this competition between historically church and state, which still exists in many countries around the world, here too, to an extent, but obviously much, much less so. But you do have this competition in terms of governance and power that comes from religiosity and the church. And historically, when times are troubled and disorderly, many people do look for comfort and order in the divine, and
Mm.
from those structures on earth that seek to channel the divine. Do you expect to see a resurgence of religion and cultism in this new world?
Yeah, I do. I do. For those reasons, I think, and I think also, we will. I mean, I sort of feel it myself personally, and having had a very sort of non-religious, secular upbringing and education, and starting, I think there is a religious turn amongst formerly secular sort of environmentalist thinkers because of the increasingly obvious defects of modernism and secular modernism, and the whole Enlightenment legacy that I think has sort of run aground. Which is not to say that it's simply like, great, let's just sort of all go to church and it'll all be fine. I mean, the church historically has not always been a great player in this, but I think you know, I I draw quite a lot in the book on Catholic social teaching and the distributist tradition, where which I do think, and sort of natural law thinking emerging out of, thinkers like Aristotle and Aquinas. I mean, I only touch on it in passing, but, you know, so there's that element to it. But yeah, you're right, actual, uh, sort of church attendance and people embracing religion. And I think, that again, as with all of the other stuff, as with all of the politics, that can go in different ways. And again, my crystal ball, I'm afraid, is too smoky. But I can see, it that can go in quite problematic directions, where I think people, and we're seeing this a bit around sort of Islamophobia, or anti-Semitism, and people sort of, again, defining their sort of religious or spiritual boundaries, and it being, developing sort of closed cults of spiritual power. Or it can be something that's much more ecumenical, much more open to cultural flow. And it's one of the interesting things about the Catholic Church is it's historically it's kind of been both of those things. It's the word Catholic, in a sense, it has been very open to sort of local possibilities, and the ability of people to, to sort of generate spirituality from the ground up. But it's also been this, this deeply hierarchical, and sometimes repressively violent, institution orchestrated from Rome, and likewise, I think there are ways of behaving that I see in both religious and secular people. It's almost like the extreme poles of like, you're an infidel, you are condemned to eternal damnation, versus a kind of logic of, or a sense of humility, a sense of being equal before a higher power over which we cannot control. And the emphasis is on ethical behavior, and being open to other people, and all of that. And you see those extremes both in secular politics and in religious belief. So I think there will definitely be more religion. I think there will be religious conflict and the closing of boundaries, but my hope is that there will also be that sense of human fallibility and humility, and sort of ability to kind of embrace other vulnerable human beings, basically, that religion does inform, or can inform.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? Just looking across the world now, for example, and seeing the way that Trump is weaponizing the religious right, and very often in those circumstances, the first thing that happens is that the rights of women get subjugated, and that's, I guess, one of my concerns about the future. And they sort of focus on women's reproductive rights in the first instance, but very often, the Catholic Church is a great example, but other churches too, of the machismo, this sort of very male-dominated societies and structures, and at the same time, as you say, on the other side, you have, the church, whether it's Christianity or Islam or Judaism, this sort of notion of alms and looking after, others in society, and kindness and generosity. Look, we need to finish, but let's finish with your local world, the world as you describe it after it's changed around you. This is the story I I've been talking about and sort of tantalizing people about over the course of the podcast. You write about this in some detail. I'm not expecting you to go through the whole 15 pages or whatever it is at this point, but can you just sort of summarize it for us now to bring us to the close?
Yeah, I mean, the little sort of fictional end piece to the book where I talk about, in about 100 years' time, in a very climate change challenged world, somebody essentially deciding to leave London, which is kind of falling apart, and head to visit a member of family, a kinswoman in Glastonbury, as a matter of fact. And so I kind of play with some of the ideas we've been talking about earlier. So part of that is that, government in London is still, that's still the core of the nation state. But, as you alluded to earlier, sort of, I think what will happen there is that it will emphasize, any sort of access to fossil energy, to exotic energy will be monopolized and used in kind of high tech arable farming to sort of keep London fed. But we sort of move out to sort of gradations of the loss of that power. I don't know if this will play out obviously exactly like this in Britain, but it's a sort of wider model for thinking about this. So then as we go out, you get other centers of power, which we're already seeing in the US, for example, in the conflict between, federal and city governance. And so, I play with the kind of People's Republic of Frome thing, so I kind of have this solar system model of Bristol and Frome being these kind of very rational republic kind of, city republics, essentially, trying to sort of lay everything out sort of rationally. But then bubbling up beyond that is more, it's more localism, people just trying to figure out how to produce food, how to manage property relations in villages that are sort of more or less coordinated with, Bristol and Frome and so on, and an element of spirituality and religion, kind of being generated bottom up in sort of fairly crazy ways versus the existing church and more established religion. And that, you mentioned the gender issue there, which is important as well. And I do talk about it a bit in the book, again, from an agricultural focus, the agrarian history of women gardeners, essentially women's gardens, and the sort of key generational transfer between mothers and daughters. So, I think the gender aspects in this are critical, and I talk about that in terms of matrilineal, which historically is associated more with horticultural than agricultural societies. So I have a male protagonist who's finding sort of a haven with a kinswoman, and part of what I'm trying to do in that little bit is discuss the way in which a sort of matrilineal inheritance of garden from mother to daughter might play out. So there's all of these different levels: centralized politics, kind of city republics, religion, sort of village generated local farming, and the sort of tensions around that, and sort of gender politics in it as well. So, it was just a way of, I suppose, trying to dramatize, the discussion earlier in the book is a little bit quasi academic and, picking these examples from around the world, and just trying to sort of bring it to life a little bit and give some local color to it. So, so that's how it pans out.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, we've got to end, Chris, but it's just been fascinating as ever talking to you, and and thanks for sort of sharing that story. And I think you're perhaps overly critical when you suggest that that it feels a bit academic, because I think it's lightly written and people can dip in and out. They don't necessarily need to read the whole thing, but I think if people do, then they will get a vast amount from this book. I think it's really, really fabulous, and I hope that people listening will go out and get a copy. But, that is, as I say, all we have time for. We've gone quite a bit over the time that we had scheduled. I'd like to thank my guest, Chris Smaje. And Finding Lights in a Dark Age is published by Chelsea Green and available wherever good books are sold. If you've enjoyed listening, please come back and listen to more. Tell your friends, like us, review us, and share our links. Farmgate is now the world's highest ranking food security podcast. And Farmgate leaders, Martin's Farm, Wheat from the Chaff, and our Filling the Funding Gap series are all available on the Farmgate channel if you just scroll back in your podcast feed. Farmgate is part of 8.9.com, the land use news channel, which is sponsored by First Milk, Pelican Ag, Rural Solutions, the USC Catchment Partnership, Agrolo, and individual donors. I've been ffinlo Costain. Bye for now.